The story you are about to hear is a compilation of documented true facts featuring historical characters, events, or places that has played a role in shaping history. Please sit back and listen as I recite this narrative for you. In 1907, a Massachusetts doctor named Duncan MacDougall wished to scientifically determine if a soul had weight. He identified 6 patients in nursing homes whose deaths were imminent. 4 were suffering from tuberculosis, 1 from diabetes, and 1 from unspecified causes. MacDougall specifically chose people who were suffering from conditions that caused physical exhaustion, as he needed the patients to remain still when they died to measure them accurately. He performed an unusual series of experiments. Intrigued by the idea that the human soul had mass and could therefore be weighed, Dr. MacDougall put together a bed fitted with a sensitive set of beam scales and convinced a series of terminally ill patients to lie on it during the final moments of their lives. MacDougall was nothing if not detail-oriented. He recorded not only each patient's exact time of death, but also his or her total time on the bed, as well as any changes in weight that occurred around the moment of expiration. He even factored losses of bodily fluids like sweat and urine, and gases like oxygen and nitrogen into his calculations. His conclusion was that the human soul weighed 3/4 of an ounce or 21 grams. One of the patients lost weight but then put the weight back on, and 2 of the other patients registered a loss of weight at death, but a few minutes later lost even more weight. One of the patients lost 3/4 of an ounce or 21.3 grams in weight, coinciding with the time of death. MacDougall disregarded the results of another patient on the grounds the scales were not finely adjusted, and discounted the results of another, as the patient died while the equipment was still being calibrated. On the belief that humans have souls and that animals do not, MacDougall later measured the changes in weight from 15 dogs after death. MacDougall said he wished to use dogs that were sick or dying for his experiment, though was unable to find any. It is therefore presumed he poisoned healthy dogs. MacDougall reported that none of the dogs lost any weight after death. That's why he said dogs don't have souls. It's hard to imagine these experiments getting any serious attention from the scientific community today, but the lines of thinking that led to them and the reactions they generated remain with us to this day. The results of MacDougall's study appeared in the New York Times in March 1907. The article set off a debate between MacDougall and the physician Augustus P. Clark, who had a field day with MacDougall's minuscule measurement techniques. Clark pointed out that at the moment of death, the lungs stop cooling the blood, causing the body's temperature to rise slightly, which makes the skin sweat, accounting for MacDougall's missing 21 grams. MacDougall fired back in the next issue, arguing that circulation ceases at the moment of death, so the skin wouldn't be heated by the rise in temperature. The debate ran all the way to the end of 1907, picking up supporters on both sides along the way. For 4 years, all was quiet on the MacDougall front, but in 1911, he graced the New York Times front page with an announcement that he'd upped the ante. This time, he wouldn't be weighing the human soul, He'd be photographing it at the moment it left the body. Although he expressed concern that the soul substance might become too agitated to be photographed at the moment of death, he did manage to perform a dozen experiments in which he photographed a light resembling that of the interstellar ether in or around patients' skull at the moments they died. MacDougall himself passed away into the interstellar ether in 1920, leaving behind a small band of ardent supporters, along with a far larger group of physicians who seemed incredulous that this farce had gone on so long. Members of the public settled down on one side or the other, and the discussion fell off the radar. Except that it never really did, at least not completely. References to MacDougall's experiments continue to spring forth in pop culture every few years, from the Victorian era right up to today. The idea that the soul weighs 21 grams has appeared in novels, songs, and movies. It's even been the title of a film. Dan Brown described MacDougall's experiments in some detail in his adventure yarn, The Lost Symbol. Mention the soul weighing experiments to a person who's into parapsychology, and you'll likely hear a murmur of approval. After all, the idea of scientific proof for the soul offers comfort in much the same way that tarot readings and hotline spiritualists do. Even among the more skeptical folks, it's a topic that comes up now and then in late-night discussions. Wasn't there once a guy who tried to weigh the soul? The experiment's actual results and their failure to achieve acceptance as scientific canon are entirely beside the point. Science has gone one way and pop culture another. Functional neuroimaging has tied every conceivable function once associated with the soul to specific regions and structures of the brain. Physics has mapped the linkages between subatomic particles so thoroughly that there's simply no space left for spiritual forces. And yet, the idea of weighing the soul remains with us. It's romantic, it's relatable, it speaks to some of our deepest longings and fears that gripped MacDougall's readers back in 1907 and still captivate us today. To understand why MacDougall wanted to weigh the soul and why he thought he could, it helps to understand the environment in which he operated. His work is rife with terms and ideas recognizable from early psychological theorists, Freud and Jung. There's a lot of talk about psychic functions and animating principles, a grasping for the precise scientific languages to describe consciousness and life itself, in a world still ignorant of fMRI and DNA. We're still profoundly ignorant today, as any honest scientist will tell you. Certain behaviors of quantum particles still baffle the brightest minds, and we're still a long way from understanding exactly how our brains do most of what they do. We keep looking for the dark matter that constitutes more than 80% of the universe mass, but we haven't actually seen a single atom of it or know where exactly it is. And in all these dark corners, we still find people looking for the soul. Some claim we'll eventually discover it among quantum particles. Others insist it's got something to do with the electromagnetic waves our brains generate. Most scientists reject these claims, but these researchers and theorists soldier on, unwilling to give up hope that one day we'll be able to weigh, measure, and quantify the hereafter. MacDougall's work resonated and continues to resonate not because of what he found or failed to find, but because of what he suggested. The simple idea behind the experiments was appealing, and for many who followed the debate in the New York Times, that idea alone was enough to make MacDougall's work worthy of discussion. In 1945, Japan was forced to sign an unconditional surrender to end the war. The country suffered a terrible social crisis due to the traumatic consequences of being in a war, the atomic bomb, the economic turmoil every country experiences during and right after such a huge conflict, and the list could go on. Besides the fact that most of Japan's population were stagnated in the worst misery, they also experienced a very interesting social phenomenon, a massive baby boom. It's believed that this phenomenon is linked to the great number of postponed marriages over the war, or even couples that were forcibly separated due to the war. But it's also linked to this need to bring life to normality, to form a family and move on from those traumatic moments. Well, it's estimated that only in Japan, about 2.6 million babies were born annually from 1947 to 1949. I mean, we know that the post-war babies are actually called baby boomers, but the numbers in Japan were just over the top. So under that context, the events we're talking about took place. There's almost no information about Ishikawa's life prior to the war. What is known is that she was born in 1897 in a small town in southern Japan called Kinitomi. She studied at the University of Tokyo, got married, started working as a midwife in the maternity ward of a hospital, and even became the director of the ward. So according to the story, she realized that the birth rate was increasing dramatically, and she noticed how couples were very worried because they barely had money to feed themselves. This made her think that the best solution was to actually leave all these newborn babies to die, since that was better than living a life of misery, disease, and suffering. I mean, it's nice to help and act when you see others going through harsh situations, but there's a huge difference between finding a viable solution to a problem and deliberately killing babies. Not only had she decided it was best for these babies to die, but in many cases, the parents asked her to do something as they were unable to even feed their child. At the time, abortions were illegal in the country. Doing anything to prevent a pregnancy was severely punished, even more than the death of a child out of neglect. So, poor people who didn't know what to do with their children, or those who didn't want them, started recurring to Ishikawa for a definite solution. Her practices weren't that secret and private, and actually, many of the other midwives working at the hospital condemned what she was doing and resigned. It's impressive that while it was an open secret, no one really did anything to stop her. She soon realized that she needed help if she wanted to get away with her plan, and so, she included her husband and a doctor at her hospital, Shiro Nakayama, in the business. I deliberately said business because that's what this spree of horrors became. They started asking their clients for money, arguing that it was going to be way less than the money they would have to pay during their child's life. Awful, right? So Miyuki Ishikawa would take care of the killings, her husband would then collect the money from the desperate parents, and Dr. Nakayama was in charge of creating false death certificates. Their scheme was perfect, or so they thought, since not so long after they started doing it, they were caught by the local police. In 1948, 2 police officers found the remains of 5 newborn babies. An investigation was set in motion after the autopsies revealed that they hadn't died of natural causes. Through witnesses and declarations, the police arrested Miyuki and her 2 accomplices. But this isn't the creepiest part of it. While they were interrogating and waiting for a trial, the investigation led the officers and detectives to a temple where they found about 30 baby bodies buried in the premises and about 40 in a mortician's house. All had died in the same way as the first 5 they found. Miyuki declared in the trial that she had nothing to do with this, and that the most likely explanation was that the parents had actually abandoned them out of their desperate economic situation. Believe it or not, that speech had some effect on the jury, and she was accused of the crime of omission instead of murder. She was only sentenced to 8 years in prison, while her accomplices only 4. The couple appealed to the Tokyo High Court, and their sentences were reduced, so she only spent 4 years and her husband 2. Due to the number of killings, Miyuki Ishikawa is considered the most prolific serial killer in the history of Japan, even when she didn't really pay for her crimes. Still, the case caused such an impact that some laws changed in Japan. For instance, the government started discussing abortion, and by 1949, it became legal under special economic circumstances as part of their eugenic protection law. Hey everyone! I just wanted to express how grateful I am that you took the time to listen to my narration. Hopefully you enjoyed it. I am Twisted Mind and please enjoy the rest of your day. Salamat! Thank you for taking the time to listen and comment. Miss Tessa Atienza, Disturbed Spirit, Dreamworks Stories, Ms. Colette, Tiktilog Stories, Eriza Miguel, Mischievous Being, Aubrey Delgado, and Pinoy HC. To those who joined me in the premiere, you guys humble me so much. Maraming salamat po. Dreamworks Stories, Miss Cafe Latte, Disturbed Spirit, Eliseo Saavedra, Aubrey Delgado, Tessa Atienza, Mundo ng Kababalaghan, Comics ni Sam, and Adam Mori. Thank you very much po, and I hope you guys have a great day.